Welcome to Imminent Domains, conversations at the crossroads of art, ecology, and the body, a companion podcast to the essay collection Imminent Domains, Reckoning with the Anthropocene, by myself, Alessandra Nacarado. Today, my guest is Robert Birch. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Robert Birch, he, him, they, is a cisgender, queer Euro settler born on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. He was raised by the shores of the Otonabe River, which in Ojibwe means river that beats like a heart. In the past 4 decades, he has led and co-participated in well over 10,000 hours of educational, community, and ceremonial circles. Since 2008, he has co-facilitated international week-long healing workshops on sex and intimacy. Birch also co-organizes neighborhood food security farming on the Coast Salish lands known as Salt Spring Island, BC, alongside playmate husband Mark. As a counselor and writer, he continues to explore the intersections of personal narrative, spontaneous ritual, and social activism. So, as we are starting this conversation, as we're stepping into our time together, I wanted to take a moment just to honor the relationship between us. I am so honored so grateful to have you as a close teacher and mentor over the past 7 years, and to have taken part in the community rituals that you hold, in the way you integrate theater work into healing work, into priestess work, to also have been at your hearth and home and eat the food of your garden and stand by your beehives and know that this lineage of queer chosen family and the love that that holds is really one that you're practicing as community care, and a kind of care and love that expands beyond your household, beyond your family, into holding space for, holding care for, holding love for, really a whole community. Our relationship, our friendship, my mentorship with you really began also when I was in a place of acute illness and complex illness that truly the world was like, that doesn't exist, So stepping into relationship with how does queer lineage arrive and respond to illness that the medical complex says, oh yeah, whatever, it doesn't exist. The response instead being, we show up for each other. We show up with love, we show up with ritual, we show up with ceremony, we show up with food. This is a tradition and a practice that I feel like I've been initiated into from you, and a tradition that I hope to carry forward from you as well. And I just want to start by deeply honoring and thanking you for that. And as I've been listening to your stories and community stories, I've also been thinking and hearing about the ways that these strategies were also really how people survived, how people cared for each other through the AIDS crisis, through the HIV/AIDS crisis, how people walked each other home, how people cared for each other. And as we start this conversation, I'm thinking about a few quotes from some writing you did in companionship with others, One of those quotes is, "We have yet to truly celebrate the soulful successes of our AIDS ancestors, the healing of our survivors, and the multitude of dykes and our other allies who had our backs." And also, if we are to find joy in our own wellness, we must choose to remember them, be ever curious, and uphold and celebrate their extraordinary contributions to our lives and indeed the world. And so while I've spoken a lot there, what I'd like to open up in this space and invite you into is to hold, simultaneously some space to both mourn and celebrate those who came before us, those we lost and those who live on through us and with us. And I was hoping, I would love if you would lead us in that a little bit, speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I'm seeing us in a circle that's ever expanding in the moment, and the gift of being invited to step forward into the fire of complex and ideally health-inducing conversations like this. What can be helpful, I've found, and I won't share exactly my own internal process, other than just to say to dance, to be with people that are still learning to trust each other coming through this pandemic, and then to imagine people who are in even greater, more dire circumstance and profound levels of grief. And that level of capacity is a skill I think our teachers and many people that have gone through genocidal or near genocidal processes come through and land in a place of another identity or another role that the community I know needs. And the only reason I can say that with a greater certainty is that my teachers have taught me this, and my mentors, this lineage, this human bibliography of creation that comes together to arrive in this moment of desperate need. And to hold that space wide open, to look beyond the problem, to look beyond blame and shame and beyond the mind's need to criticize what it doesn't want, and step more heartfully into the moment that's happening, is to look at our capacities. And we've talked about this before, moving beyond what other people and the stigmas of pathologizing experience. And one way to revitalize that is to be in a state, a collective state of supporting each other's stamina, right? Like, wow. And in that stamina, that capacity, we can, I mean, I'm even just talking about it, my spine redignifies itself through traumatic experiences and the PTSD each of us carry in different places. It's, again, a very complex part of the conversation to say, where do we enter into what we now understand to be trauma narratives, which in itself is so unfair, even though it's true, because we know to step into experiences of our trauma, personal, collective, the only way to feel this new role, which many of us have come through after trauma, is that of the survivor. It took me personally 25 years to fully step into that role of, wow, I'm a survivor of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And I could feel it in my body, in my heart, my psyche. And in that moment, I gave myself permission to not even have to fully understand what that means. But again, I could feel a new dignity, the sense of arrival, of having come through. And the only way I can touch on that in my own life is because I've been surrounded with survivors through the duration of my 55 years on the planet. And we can go super wide with that. Just every woman I've ever met is a survivor of genocidal personal, biological, and cultural processes. It's undeniable. And of course, through every culture and races and sexualities and gender explorations, every movement has confronted a genocidal process. And in these movements, extraordinary skills and strategies of how to continue to love in the face of horror and violence. Like, it's jaw-dropping, it's heart-opening, and it's almost too much to fully imagine unless we can look and find our place in the lineage of survivorship. And to do so opens up a lot of other conversations of what is illness and who's hostessing an illness, and all the pieces that you brilliantly woven in your book around illness, climate crises, and colonization. Like, it's all right in our cellular, it's in our DNA process. But our DNA is more than a biological process. It's also a cultural process. So that's a little bit, I mean, that's a long, thick response to your question, but how to locate ourselves in that process really requires some, I needed to be held. Somebody, a mentor, had to take me by the hands, get me a little stoned sometimes, walk me through the streets of San Francisco into Ward 10C, the very first AIDS ward, 5B, and walk me into an experience where he could say, oh yeah, that was where the first janitor used to go who clean up after another gay man had died. And he was the only one, this Latin man, who was willing and desperate enough to do the job of cleaning up during the earliest years of AIDS. The beautiful thing about having a mentor walk us through pieces is the unexplained happens. And I share, I know maybe I'm just carrying in the flow of this memory process, but Ed Wolf was one of my blessed, I'm alive today. Get a little choked in my throat. I'm alive today because of my mentors. There's no way I would have survived. I just couldn't do it alone. But Ed one day took me to the first AIDS ward, and he was a volunteer there in the earliest days and then became a counselor and then an international trainer of counselors. So we're walking down the hall and it's relatively empty at that particular moment. And there's a woman, a Latin woman at the end of the hall in deep grief. A nurse comes by, and a busy nurse at the time, and she says, is there something you need? I don't know quite what she said. Anyways, this woman was so upset, she just barked at her. And Ed, who's 6'7" tall, we're walking down. We just kept walking towards her. And because I'd had Ed, who'd shared with me so many of the stories of surviving and the crazy things that they did in order to survive, I felt compelled just to walk up to this woman, just the sheer humanity, say, may I offer you a hug? Like the very simplest of needs, where today we're not even allowed to touch each other. She fell onto my arms and wept. And she was in an altered state in her grief. She just looked up at Ed and me and she said, are you angels? Are you angels? And she said, would you please come just touch my dying brother? We walk into the room. There's the mother and the uncle and this, what would have been this beautiful gay man. So, and you have to understand, this is like 20, 30 years after. So this would have been 2010 or 12 maybe. And I had a moment with him, and a private moment, and I just whispered in his ears, but he was there as somebody, he was about to enter into the realm of the ancestors, and just the honor of being invited to somebody's deathbed just simply because you offered a hug. You know? So that, again, that would never happen. There's no education possible. There's nothing in our institutionalized awareness that could walk us through impossibilities without having somebody who's gone through it themselves and rightfully says, I want you to know what this is like. And ultimately then reapply, I'll finish with this, just this, reassert one's own lived experience and PTSD and trauma into a larger context that brings us into the place of things. And that in itself has a healing function. Yeah, mentors and friends.
Thank you so much.
Mm.
I'm deeply moved and grateful to be hearing those stories, and yeah, just letting that resonate in my bones right now.
There's an archetype of the psychopomp that the fairies, the radical fairies, and a lot of gay men uh, understood as one of their roles in society. In a healthier society, you have these characters known as psychopomps, which are the gatekeepers between life and death. They hold open the portal.
Mm.
And in practical terms, that means really being present, uh, a midwife, right? So that notion of being midwives at the other end of the story. Um, and to do that with a shared dignity again is just extraordinary. There's so much love to it. So we've got people like Captain Snowden and Kath Kelly both coming out with their books, and in the HIV community up here, we're working towards, which will extend out to the wider queer trans community, is doing end of life planning together. Like, so we're actually able to feel our way into this, not just work at a legalized process and have that okay done, which itself would be great, but to actually weave our understanding what death and dying from a community perspective actually means, which will give honor to our stories, our desires, and on a political organizational front, it could also shift the paradigm of transferring what other people, I think this is a colonizing notion of legacy, but that the baton being passed, right? And one of our great true legacies is our stories. That's basically what we're talking about right now. And inside our stories are incredible buried treasure, skills, a strategy of survival, basically, and to do it with humor and grace. And yeah, there's so much more available to us when we can actually find ourselves in a circle. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. I feel like that's so deeply, having been able to spend time in the woods, sitting with members of community who have been doing this work together for 40 years, and late at night around a fire, just starting to hear their stories, hear stories from you. And I'm so grateful for you coming here to share some of them. And actually, the very opening, as you know, of this book, the opening of the introduction of this book, speaks to time I spent in a community that you're part of. And I wanted to read just that first paragraph, and then I thought you might be able to speak more to that place and that approach. So this is the very opening of Imminent Domains, of the introduction, and really this is the idea that in many ways started the book, my thinking. It's some of the ideas that I came back to again and again as I wrote this work. Some years ago, I found myself on a farm near the border of California. It was late June and drought had fully set in. The grounds were bone dry. The clearing by the barn had no grass left. Up on the distant hills, you could see where previous fires had burned swaths of the forest away, large patches of brown amidst the verdant green. I was there for a week-long retreat that was part environmental action, part spiritual practice, and they gathered us in a circle once everyone arrived. "We are in fire season," our hosts explained, dust rising from the cracked earth between us. "If a forest fire begins, we will ring the farm bell continuously." And then we'd have to run, they told us, back to the clearing to grab shovels from a pile. Before the flames could spread, we'd have to head toward them and dig a trench deep and wide enough to keep the fire at bay. The instructions alarmed me. Who runs toward a fire? Without training, without protection, without water. But around the circle, people were nodding. This is how most forest fires are contained. Not with water, but with trenches. And deep in those drought lands on that arid farm, a place used as a queer hospice, during the early years of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, we were hours from a fire station. There were no experts, no fire trucks, no beacons of safety nearby. Our best chance was one another. Our best chance was to face the emergency with what we had and to run not right into the flames, but toward them. So I wanted to read that in this moment because I feel like this is a way of being that I'm continuing to learn from you. Also because that part of the book, that opening, speaks to being in a community that you are part of, a land that you know well, a tradition that is really yours. And I would love in this moment if you could speak to this tradition, anything you'd like to share about this place, this way of being, this tradition that you're part of.
Thank you. The poetry of your words provides an opportunity to imagine running to the fire together. Thank you. And I also think when you're reading the elements, how you work with the elements of the crisis of fire, and that the element of water isn't enough. And I thought, actually, it's the embodied water of sweat equity, digging those trenches, which is a new boundary system, regrowing, sweating our way into creating a deeper boundary system. It's a very evocative image. Thank you. Wolf Creek, Southern Oregon. It's a place where I deepened my awareness and experience of elders and ancestral medicine that Daniel Four now talks about, actually participating in ancestral magic in a way that honors literally the ashes, the blood and bone and semen of so many gay men, and how many of the people in that region, San Francisco and north and surrounding all over North America, really. The radical fairies are all throughout Western society. But in this particular place, there's altars all over. I think, I don't know how many acres is, I think about 100 acres maybe in total. But in the early 80s, rather than just creating a commune, they ended up buying a commune, a gay commune that was existing mid 70s, purchasing the land, and they had land stewards, which still exists today. And there's been many iterations of how this land and community have woven itself together. And a lot of it's been very messy, very complicated and difficult. The necessary work of evolving our awareness of the karmic imprint of colonization and gender. So we were doing a lot of work around gender and sexuality, almost apart from each other, as to what's emerged now is the a much broader and much more nuanced understanding of how sex and gender and sexuality are all an evolving process. But that was happening there. And we're still working as a community on so many of the edges, having initiated through a white, primarily cis gay male reality, which has since shifted a lot in many parts of the world. But here on this land, these altars, so even though through all those sociological and cultural shifts and challenges, there's still a place where people recognize how the HIV and AIDS movement impacted this designated body of humanity. To do that work of healing and evolution, knowing that in the soil is the blood and bones and ashes of those who've gone before us, it shifted me out of a heteronormative understanding of ancestry into a cultural ancestry. And how biological and cultural ancestry can weave, they can be each other's healers. They can be a response to that karmic imprint. And they can ask us to be more accountable to the things that our privileges would let us hide from. But culturally, if we're on the edge and listening to new generations coming forward, the descendants, we can go, oh, right, my whole biological ancestral lineage were probably at least 400 years of it were deeply engaged in what we now understand to be a racist project of resource extraction, which affected their health, their lungs, their bodies, their economies, their communities, right? And you paint that out in the book. So at Wolf Creek, it just happened to be a place where we could explore the edges of those understandings more consciously and playfully.
There are a few more quotes from your work I wanted to share as we shift towards the arc of the end of our time together, that really have sat with me as I've been thinking of these pieces of illness as a teacher, illness and adaptation as calls towards life, and queerness as a liberating force. So these are some quotes from the co-authored introduction and then one piece from your essay. Whether we choose it or not, our sex lives are political tools that can destroy or build futures. Many of us have remarkable tales of survival. Finding each other and sharing our scars and strategies can be exhilarating. Our methods of adaptation are the template we need for community education and health. And also, we are not the world's problem. As a people, we are in fact one of the great liberating solutions to our global crises. And finally, from an essay you wrote, and this really directly speaks to what you were just sharing, the essay Disclosure that you wrote that was recently published. My letter begins, "Dear virus, you are the unwanted guest. I am not you. I am not HIV positive. We now live together. You need bodies to live in, and I want to keep living. So here's the rule to this house. In choosing this body as host, I choose you, viral interloper, as a teacher." And I feel that teaching, that choice, that sovereignty of that choice really present with us here today, and really want to honor and acknowledge that, and just give so much gratitude to you for sharing these stories, for carrying that work forward, for recognizing that what comes into our life through illness, through chronic pain, through disability is not necessarily a side story. it doesn't have to be like this side note or this thing I recovered from. It could very well be the central, beautiful story of how our lives transformed, of how we step into the gift and calling of our life and what we have
Mhm.
to offer this world in turn. So I wanted to give a little space for that if there's anything you'd like to share.
Yeah. And I think the only piece I'd add to that is these terrible vulnerabilities help us find people who can be in their own vulnerabilities. I mean, that co-resonance changes the narrative, changes how experiences have happened. It it reclaims some of our lived experience, a lot of our lived experience outside of a medicalized, institutionalized reality, and not to dismiss what's needed there by any stretch. But it, as you said, it brings that agency, and with that agency, co-agency, incredible shifts do occur. Mm, yeah. When I made that statement about teacher, it was a naive, came from a naive place that bore some truth out over time as more teachers that had gone through harder experiences than I had were able to see me and hold and lift me up until I could see them. And I
Mm.
could see the culture within which all these experiences, more of the cultures within which these experiences are situated. And that sense of meaning, belonging, and purpose is its own respite.
Mm.
And it keeps changing, of course. So, yeah, to being each other's teachers ultimately and guides. Yeah. I also think
Incredible.
I was thinking Dr. Marcus Greatheart was a co-author on the annals of gay sexuality, contemporary HIV zeitgeist. And it was really us all lying around on New Year's in just hanging out in bed, just cuddled up with friends, really literally in physical, intimate contact with people we love and care about and who carry our histories together. That these ideas came forward. What I created is I would take no ownership for it. I'm just honored to be part of it, and inspired by people like yourself and so many others who give it their all. Like, wow. And knowing the amount of suffering that happens through the creative process too, but suffering towards healing rather than suffering and emptiness and despair. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Birch. That, yeah, will really sit with me. And this beautiful image of this joyful embodied practice of writing that introduction is so beautiful. Just the other pieces of how we create, that the body is not separate from the words we write. And the way we create is part of this whole piece. And before we close, before we get to our last question, I would love if you, speaking of creative work, if you would share a bit of your incredible story, your recently published work. In your essay, Disclosure, you speak to the necessity of modeling the interactions we want to be part of. And I was hoping you could read to us from the lesion tree.
This is from Matilda Sycamore, incredible writer and editor, a book, an anthology called Between Certain Death and Possible Life, and queer stories of pretty much the second generation of us having come through the HIV/AIDS crisis. I'm in Northern California to meet my dear friend and mentor, Ed's a giant of a man who showed up to volunteer on the first AIDS ward in San Francisco at the beginning of the epidemic. As an international HIV counselor, trainer, he reminds people of the necessity of modeling the interactions we want to be part of, the need to reassure people in crises, and that in the end, we need to extend amnesty to ourselves and one another. We're high up in the Yuba Hills when Ed walks me into an enormous tree in the middle of a dry riverbed. He explains that each winter the waters rise high enough for fallen trees to tumble downriver to bash into this one large tree. In the center of this tree, an enormous wound bleeds golden sap. Ed's younger partner, Kirk, has dubbed it the lesion tree. As the story goes, my mentor and a few off-shift nurses brought some of the earliest AIDS patients out on the camping trips each summer. Being out in nature inspired one young man to take off his shirt. His body was covered in KS lesions, and he exposed these wounds to the sun for the first and perhaps last time. He died the next fall. The following summer, at his request, his ashes were brought to the lesion tree. Over the years, several young gay men who died alone of AIDS and with no other resting place had their ashes placed here. It's my turn to take off my clothes. I settle into the base of the tree. Ed, my gay elder, my friend, sits at the edge of the river, leaning heavily on a stick. His aching joints need rest. I reach out and touch the golden, viscous sap with my fingers. I place some of it on my forehead, my heart, and on my soul. I close my eyes and feel the heat of the river rocks on my exposed body. I think of these men, those times. I ask them for help. I also offer myself to this tree. I imagine my ashes being placed here one day too. The storm can't hold. Waves of nausea riding on memories of failed disclosures flood through my body, dozens of interrupted and missed connections. Shame's floodgates open. I begin to wail. I begin to wail as compassion begins to well up within me, first for myself, then for the men buried here, then for us all. When the grief subsides, I stand, dress, and join Ed on a fallen tree along the shoreline. Graciously, Ed says, watching me was like witnessing the spirits of those men rise out of the tree as if released from an indifferent world. He gently directs my attention to what grows behind the lesion tree. There, a stand of younger trees, readying themselves for the ravages of winters to come. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I am very full in my heart and deeply moved by that story and by your sharing of it. And so grateful to get to hear it in your voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me share that. It feels good to touch on it again.
And as we get to the close of our time together, just really holding so much gratitude in my heart for you as my teacher, as my queer elder, as my friend, as someone who has and will again come eat at your table sometime soon.
Mm-hmm.
And the question I have for you, that I have for everyone who's going to join me here, is what do you think is possible? What world do you think is possible?
The world that we co-create, in the one that's embodied, that can touch and be touched with permission, a world that can receive touch in a healthy, safe way, and the extraordinary interpersonal and interspecies experience of how to make that possible. And not to run from the impossible, but to have some enthusiasm in the face of it, beyond ideologies of pessimism and optimism. Perhaps it's some of our natures to go through those dark nights of the soul, but also to help one another up to a more enthusiastic shared space where we're willing to pick up those shovels in your metaphor. We're willing to be in those spaces, those temporary moments of sanctuary where we can both breathe, relax, and reimagine. Those places of refuge and sanctuary that allow a community to recognize that not only is another world possible, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. And the more joy for us choosing to place our seed, to place our imaginations on the altar of that possibility. Nothing's ever been created without imagination. So coming together in imaginative spaces allows us not to only dream, but to participate in supporting each other, to play a part that we never imagined initially playing by ourselves. Yeah. None of it, it's not going to be easy. It's not easy. It's never been easy. But there can be a simplicity when we find an organizing principle that's based in care. And if for those of us who've gone through that process of being told that we don't matter, that should suggest to us how much we do matter. That the world's violence is trying to cut us off from the very resource that can help us evolve more consciously, and that's one another. Our pain, like this fire, is to gently, with support, lean into pain together and hold each other's hand for as long as we dare. Something will happen that will make meaning, that will nourish our souls, that will give promise to something that we'll never be around to see. Wow. It's humbling, isn't it? It's like looking at the back of a book and seeing the bibliography and seeing hundreds of years of consciousness weave itself into a certain position that's being offered today. We're that living library. So we'll see. Or not. At least we'll have a little bit of pleasure on the way. That's my wish for everybody. More pleasure, conscious pleasure, as a healing foundation to taking healthier risks.
Thank you. I'm holding that wish with you. What a beautiful place to close our conversation. I will be carrying on this just incredible share, this storytelling, this dream of pleasure and togetherness, this ancestor magic and lineage as I go away from this conversation, knowing that I will have the absolute privilege of speaking with you again soon, and also knowing that others will get to hear and listen and share in the wisdom that you hold, and the possibility that this story may carry forward and reach others.